Week 16 on your way tomorrow, kickoff, Christmas Day, with the Minnesota Vikings at the New Orleans Saints. But here's 5 kickers that shouldn't be in your Week 16 lineup. The first guy, Stephen Gostkowski of the Tennessee Titans. Gostkowski, he's been up and down this season, but he's just too inconsistent for my taste. And he's a guy that misses a lot of extra points, it seems like, this season. And the last few weeks he's been okay, with 3 fantasy points in Week 13, which was a dud game. Week 14, 9 fantasy points. In Week 15, 8. And this week at Green Bay gives up the 12th least amount of fantasy points to kickers. I think this is a game where Tennessee knows field goals aren't going to do much in this one. They got to keep scoring touchdowns. So I think Gostkowski, his chances are going to be limited in this one to mostly extra points or short yardage field goals. So I think Gostkowski, he's an easy kicker to bench this week with the better options out there. So he'll be the first kicker to bench. The second one's Ka'im Fairbairn of the Houston Texans. Fairbairn, he's had some good games this season, but he's been up and down. And this week versus Cincinnati, I think this Houston Texan team, they're going to just keep finding the end zone. I know Cincinnati gives up the 5th most fantasy points to kickers, but Fairbairn, he's only had 1 double-digit fantasy game at kicking since Week 11, so that's not a great sign. There's better options out there, and there's a reason he's not started in many fantasy leagues. So in this game, sure, I could see him have a big game, but I could also see him have a 1-point fantasy day like he did versus Chicago in Week 14. So Fairbairn, it's better off he's benched this week and not started in any leagues. The third kicker I would bench this week, if you really have great options, this is Will Lutz of the New Orleans Saints. Lutz, he's been struggling the last few weeks with single-digit games. In Week 13, he had 2 points. Week 14, 2, and last week versus Kansas City, 3. But the good news this week, he does versus the Minnesota Vikings that give up the 3rd most fantasy points to kickers. I know Lutz has been struggling, but if you have amazing options, then you bench him. But this week, I'm sticking with him in one league in my championship, and I think Lutz can hit the uprights a few times. But a lot of people, they've been down on him, so if they want to bench him, bench him. But I don't really recommend it, but I couldn't find anyone else here really worthy of the bench. The 4th kicker I will bench this week's Joey Sly of the Carolina Panthers. Sly here, he's been up and down this season, and he's missed a couple easy shots, but the last few weeks he's been pretty good in fantasy. In Week 14, 9 fantasy points, and last week with 10 versus Green Bay, but this week versus Washington, I don't know if this Panther team will do much in the red zone, to be honest. This Washington front 7 is pretty solid. They're going to get to Teddy Bridgewater and that weak offensive line a lot in this game, and I could see Sly with a limited amount of attempts to possibly 2 or 3 field goal attempts in this one. And he's been shaky where he can miss one easily this week. So Joey Sly, I know people like him a lot in fantasy, but I just wasn't a great fan of him this year, and the numbers don't lie. He's been inconsistent. So he's a kicker I think you could bench this week. And the 5th and final kicker is Dan Bailey of the Minnesota Vikings. Bailey, he's been up and down, but in big spots, I just feel like he can't get the job done. And last week he had a bounce-back performance after missing 4 field goals and a couple extra points in Week 14 versus Tampa. In Week 15 versus Chicago, he had 25-yarder, a 28-yarder, and 3 PATs. But this week in New Orleans, I know it's indoors as well, but Bailey in a big playoff game, fantasy game, championship, whatever it is for you, I just can't trust him in this situation. And somehow he's still owned in 31% of fantasy leagues. So that's 5 kickers I would bench here heading into Week 16.